Can poetry be useful when the world is in the grip of coronavirus? That's a question driving a new international project led by the UK poet Carol Ann Duffy and the Manchester Writing School at Manchester Metropolitan University. The initiative, Right Where We Are Now, is a poetic response to the coronavirus pandemic. Poets are invited to send in their writing, marking where and when their poem was written. The works are then published online in chronological order in the hope of creating a kind of living record of what's happening now, seen through poets' eyes. Well, joining me this evening is award-winning poet Andrew McMillan and Romalyn Ante, who has written for the project and is currently working as a nurse in the UK's National Health Service. Hello to you both. Andrew, I'm going to start with you because you're on the left and because of alphabetical order of your first name. You've written a poem called Garden. I'd love it if you could just read us your poem, please.
Absolutely. Garden. In the beginning, the dead, like the first flowers for Adam, were few enough to name them, but soon they grew too many, the vast fields of them.
Andrew, tell us about the meaning of that poem. What led you to that?
Absolutely. So the whole project that Carol Ann and Manchester Metropolitan University came up with was, as you say, this idea of really documenting day by day what was happening. And I wrote this poem on the 25th of March, so a month ago today, when the death numbers were smaller than they are now, but we were seeing in other countries that they were going to get higher, that we were going to be kind of faced with these unfathomable numbers. And I think that so much of what the pandemic has given us is abstract, these abstract numbers of deaths, the abstract nature of illness. And what I tried to do in this very short poem was just ground that in something concrete, think about flowers instead of the deaths, and try and weigh those two things together.
Thanks, Andrew. We're going to move on to Romalyn. You've also got a poem you've written called Unbecoming Marmot. It has got half a dozen verses, but we've asked you to just read us a few lines, please.
Yes, of course. Look at her now, as she puts 2 pots of ice cream onto the table of a patient in isolation, or nods at the veteran on bed 18, telling tales of the underground tunnel turned into a ward, or shares a box of pizza with a doctor who's been there all week until crumbs constellate their fingertips.
And the inspiration behind that poem?
So I have been a nurse for almost 8 years now. I came from the family of nurses. My mother is a nurse, my sister and sister-in-law are nurses, and they all work in the front line. At the moment, I work as a nurse practitioner providing psychotherapeutic treatment for young people. I wrote this just after a very difficult session with a young person. And when I was invited to write a poem that would shed a light on our current situation now, I really want to shed a light on the nursing profession, especially on the medical nurses and all nurses really. So most of the images that I've used here are from my own medical experience and also most especially from my mother's medical experience.
Thank you to you both for reading out those extracts. I could almost feel the worries of news fade away as we enter that world of poetry. Andrew, you've suggested that isolation and poetry seem to have something in common. They're both about tiny moments with larger meaning.
I think that's true. I think that we've all been confronted in these last 5 weeks with our own thoughts, with our own kind of creative instincts to want to help, to want to do things, but also a lot of us that aren't frontline workers, that aren't those kind of heroes in the NHS and elsewhere, a lot of us have felt helpless. A lot of us have felt that what can we do? And poetry is a way of capturing that day by day experience, because we are living, even if it sounds like a cliche, through incredibly historic times. And poetry becomes a way of recording that and bearing witness, I think, for future generations.
Romalyn, moving back to you, I'm sure there's one question our audience must be dying to ask you. You're a nurse and a poet. They don't always go together. Explain how they mesh.
I think as a nurse and as a poet, even though you say they don't always go together, I feel that both professions, I wouldn't even call it professions, I would call it a calling. So both of them are mostly a calling for me. I feel that as a nurse and as a poet, I try to make sense of not only the world around me, but the world inside me. And I think that's very related to each other.
Andrew, there is a stereotype of poets which presumably you must hate. Remote, dreamy figures with their heads in the clouds. But since now real life has turned all of us into a waking dream, presumably poets feel more normal to the rest of the world.
I think that's it. I mean, I think poets sometimes think, well, this is sometimes the life that we've been in training for, to be shut away, to be thinking, to be writing. But I think also what it's really shown is that poets aren't necessarily as removed from the real world as people like to think. I saw a great report on the BBC the other day about a bin man that had been given a poem by a neighbour as a way of thanking him. And we know that people go to poems for funerals, for weddings when they're allowed those, and that poetry occupies this odd space where it's both marginalised day to day in people's lives, but actually has this very heightened sense of importance to them. And we've seen in these last few weeks, as people have become more scared, more anxious, that they've begun to write poems again. They've begun to want to read poems again. And so this new database, the Right Where We Are Now, is a way of trying to capture that for future generations.
Romalyn, what's the response to your poems?
I've got some friends who've read it and they really like it. Some of my colleagues have read it. And the most interesting part is, even though the images that I used are mostly from my experiences and my mother's experiences, every nurse colleague can relate to it. And it's very interesting how, even though we may be having unique experiences to us, the core feeling of a line or lines could be felt not by everyone, really.
Romalyn Ante and Andrew McMillan, thank you both so much.
Thank you.